Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about economics. So there's an old saying that a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, and a depression is when you lose your job. So never in the history of the world has the disparity of wealth between rich and poor been as great as it is today. In fact, there's no example in human history where wealth has accumulated like this and the pitchforks didn't come out. You show me a highly unequal society, and I will show you a police state. But how did the US economy go from selling us like the American dream to selling us these diamond-studded handcuffs? And the answer is neoliberalism. So if you're unfamiliar with what neoliberalism is, and I'm sure most people are, it's not as the structure of the name suggests. You know, it's not new liberalism. In fact, liberalism and the common usage of the phrase has nothing to do with it. So neoliberalism is the philosophy of a libertarian economy. The concept was created by Milton Friedman and 35 other intellectual D-bags in 1947. Today, neoliberalism, God, that's a hard word to say, underpins all national economic policies throughout the world. Essentially, the philosophy behind neoliberalism is that individuals should have the freedom to make their own economic decisions, and governments should not interfere with individuals' choices, which doesn't seem so bad when, you know, at the outset, but damn, like things always get messed up, right? So, neoliberalism believes that the sole goal of the economy and business is to generate financial wealth. The freedom of the individual, person, or corporation is the primary societal value. Governments should be small, protecting individuals and their private property. If we just let free markets sort things out, all will be well. To a neoliberal, the answer is always less government. Reduce government borrowing, spending, and debt so there is more money for businesses to spend and the economy will grow. Seems logical. Uh, What is the best way to reduce debt according to neoliberals? Well, cut taxes, especially on the wealthy, because with more money in their pockets, the rich will invest, creating jobs and creating economic activity. They say a rising tide lifts all boats. And since the free markets are perfect, according to neoclassical economists, we should increase the we should increase the freedom of markets globally through free trade agreements. This narrative is simply wrong, to put it clear and simple. And in this video, I will explain why. So pretty much, the founders of neoliberal philosophy said, let's just get rid of all rules and see what happens. And um, things went horribly wrong. While the short-term gains were remarkable for the American middle-class baby boomer generation, the consequences of the philosophy have created a burden for new generations and the environment at large. However, proponents of neoliberalism believe that inequality is not only inevitable, but perfectly acceptable. The rationale behind this is that any form of collective action imposed by a government is a form of collectivism, which is a form of socialism. Therefore, collective action will result in tyranny. This rationale is supported by citing the millions of people murdered in Germany and Russia who dared oppose collectivism by questioning the role of the state. As we can see, neoliberal philosophy is the antithesis to socialist doctrine. And the core of neoliberal philosophy is libertarianism, which the majority of the American middle class believe is what keeps us safe from tyranny. And it is through the libertarian core value that governments should not meddle in individual choices or have the power to micromanage the economy that wealth has become the greatest measure of success in our lives. And if wealth is a sign of success, shouldn't we do everything we can to promote and increase it? So there's a common word for this type of thinking, the kind of thinking where inequality is perfectly acceptable, the dismissal of poor people as parasites, and the sole purpose of the individual is to generate wealth. It's called greed. The funny thing about neoliberalism is that it is generally only discussed in academic conversations. Yet, the dominant fundamental architecture of Western ideology is neoliberalism. And even though neoliberalism is precisely what destroyed the American dream, conservatives will fight tooth and nail to protect it. So what's funny is that the majority of conservatives have no idea what neoliberalism is. If you asked them to it, they couldn't define it if it was tattooed on the back of their hand. Uh, but they believe in it so strongly. And this did not happen by accident. So idiots are rarely a safe bet, but useful idiots are as dependable as the sunrise. Enter stage left, Ronald Reagan. So Ronald, along with Margaret Thatcher, propped up as the face of neoliberal ideology by think tanks such as the Koch brothers Heritage Foundation, was able to sell neoliberalism as the global economic ideology. Baby boomers, as useful idiots, were given houses with zero money down at a 1% interest rate and didn't make a fuss while deregulation was implemented and corporations assumed greater control over global economies. So, in this period of Reaganomics, we see hostile corporate takeovers that consumed many smaller companies. Mom and pop shops became a thing of the past. Products no longer said made in America. They were replaced with products that said made in China. Corporations began engaging in this orgy of outsourcing and offshoring costs and profits, costing millions of American jobs. So the fast forward, the 2008 financial collapse was predictable result of neoliberalism. What do we think would happen if we gave everyone multiple houses for next to nothing at adjustable interest rates while simultaneously outsourcing their jobs to foreign nations? Well, how about the evaporation of $50 trillion and the loss of 80 million jobs? And after the chickens came home to roost in 2008, when interest rates reset, um, did the neoliberal philosophy or the libertarian philosophy of neoliberalism, where the free markets would simply sort themselves out, come into effect to save the day? No. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Big banks were bailed out while CEOs got their golden parachutes on taxpayer dollars. The rich got even more disgustingly rich, and the working class took the hit. So the question I have for Republicans is, do you really think libertarianism can exist under a neoliberal framework? I know most of you claim to be libertarians, but believing libertarianism exists under neoliberal policy is the false nationalist belief that production of goods in the US still occurs within US borders, which it doesn't. Everything says made in China on it. So like nations no longer exist, but they're just links in this global economic chain. Therefore, libertarianism is a relic of the past that Republicans cling to because they're too blind to realize that capitalism and democracy no longer exist in the United States. For example, the government's response to the 2008 financial crisis proves that free markets do not exist. They bailed everybody out. That's not the free market. Further, it exposed the fact that neoliberalism has become so powerful that the government is no longer a government, it's a corporation. Therefore, everything you believe about American nationalism is false. You think that America is a democracy when it's controlled by corporations through lobbying. Like, really, bro? Like, come on. The Supreme Court literally passed Citizens United, and you think that the US still exists? You think the government's real? It's a corporation. You think capitalism exists when the free market is a total illusion and the magician isn't even bothering to conceal the tricks anymore? Like, you call yourself a capitalist, but most of you have no capital to show for it. Like, how are you a capitalist with no capital? And without capital, you're excluded from any path to real prosperity. And this drives inequality at a terrifying rate. And such inequality erodes democracy and will collapse the economy. So there is no longer a democracy, it's a corporate oligarchy. And neoliberalism brought us here because baby boomers were so blinded by their own greed and fear of socialism and collectivism that they allowed corporations to infiltrate the government to the point that it no longer exists. And if the 2000 financial aid If the 2008 financial crisis wasn't a wake-up call, baby boomers doubled down and voted in a populist nationalist billionaire into the Oval Office in 2016. And like, it wouldn't be funny if it wasn't so terrifying. So the same think tanks, such as the Koch brothers, Heritage Foundation, that sold baby boomers on neoliberalism during the Reagan era, are today duping them into pointing the finger at poor people, minorities, immigrants, school teachers, and college professors as the problem, and masterfully pulling the attention away from the real problem, which is billionaires. These think tanks rely on the mental laziness of those who blame the most vulnerable members of society for their problems rather than simply following the money and identifying the billionaires as the ones who strip them of their resources, labor, money, and healthcare, which is why I call them useful idiots. So John Maynard Keynes stated that practical men who believe themselves exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Fox News, The Daily Wire, all these conservative news sources that people listen to, I don't know why, uh, have them stocking up on food, ammunition, buying land in the country, and preparing for this race war that will ensue after the collapse that they also know is inevitable. When instead, if they had any sense, they would already be fighting in the class war rather than the race war. And this class war is necessary to prevent the collapse of civilization. However, the dominant hegemonic powers that uphold neoliberalism squash any form of uprising with brutal force, and more often than not, control any form of opposition. So we see this in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Libya, Palestine, Ukraine, Iraq, and every other conflict around the world can be traced back to natural resources and even domestic um, um, opposition, such as Antifa or whatever these groups are. They're CIA. So like uh, on an international scale, neoliberal policy has created division between the global north and the global south, where the resources from the global north are continuously extracted for the benefit of the global north from the global south. This is done through structural adjustment loans from the World Bank. Essentially, the World Bank gives out risky loans to developing nations, knowing these loans cannot be paid back. Sound familiar to the 2008 financial crisis? And when these loans go into default, which they will, structural adjustment kicks in and the IMF takes over the loan. The IMF labels the natural resources of developing nations as collateral for the bad loans the World Bank gave out, knowing that they were going to default. And then they strip them of their natural resources and send them to the global north. This is how the extractive economy in the world works. So the philosophy behind this is that the global north can steal the rainforests of the global south, and the global south can just simply grow a new rainforest, which is insane. Uh, so this is the extractive economy in a nutshell. And this is precisely why neoliberal policy is to blame for the global environmental crisis. I repeat that. Neoliberalism, one thing. It's only one thing to blame for the global environmental crisis. It is neoliberalism. Um, so while this philosophy has been beneficial for the GDPs of developed nations for the past few decades and claims to have lifted millions out of poverty, the distribution of this wealth has been increasingly consolidated into the hands of corporate elite. The global extractive economy of consumption has not delivered the quality of life that it promised. Instead, people struggle to make ends meet or find purpose in their life. Failure to ensure that billions of people who feel left behind by the system can not only find a sense of self-worth, but also support themselves and their families will have severe political consequences. While populist politicians blame migrants, refugees, trade from other countries, and build stories based on taking back control and making America great again, history shows that this is a dangerous path. In this century, where so many of our problems are global in scope, populations increase and resources are constraining, the consequences are likely to be disastrous. The rise of populism, racism, xenophobia, and nativism portrays migrants as threats to jobs, a source of crime, rising welfare costs. But to neoliberals, this is a predictable response because inequality is perfectly acceptable to them. And with this mentality, collapse is inevitable. So the old narrative of neoliberalism is not only morally bankrupt under the neoclassical economic modeling assumptions where we can have infinite growth on a finite planet, markets are fair, prices tell the truth, uh, more income equals more happiness. All of these have proven to be myths. This narrative is not only socially bankrupt, morally bankrupt, it is also scientifically bankrupt as well. So the current economic narrative is unsuited to meet our needs and is based on fantasy. Robert Nadeau stated, neoclassical economic theory is predicated on unscientific assumptions that massively frustrate or effectively undermine efforts to implement scientifically viable economic policies and solutions. The strategies used to create neoclassical economics copied these physics equations and changed the names of variables where utility becomes synonymous with energy, and the sum of utility and expenditure is synonymous with potential and kinetic energy. Nowhere in these mathematical or physical models is the value of ecological resources or human well-being counted. Infinite growth is assumed to be possible even when based on non-renewable resources, which is crazy. Uh, can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. Further, economists routinely assign a discount rate to their calculations to the future worth of a project to reflect the belief that you would rather have a reward today than a reward tomorrow. But under this practice, the future becomes worthless. These dangerously simplistic assumptions treat economics as a science where outcomes are predicted mathematically, but bastardize the physics that they are trying to emulate. This is called physics envy. So therefore, neoclassical and neoliberal economics are scientifically, practically, intellectually, morally, and socially bankrupt. So you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. The neoliberal narrative has brought humanity to the verge of ruin, and it's time for a new story. This isn't an ideology of the right or the left. It's a matter of survival of modern human civilization as we know it. The construction of a new story is necessary as the first step. Once we can envision um, Once we can envision this, we can begin to work towards a sustainable world in which people live within nature in a way that meets their human needs without degrading natural systems. No one knows how close we are to collapse, but most scientists believe that this will happen within the next few decades. Abundant evidence shows that it is possible to shift to a better economic system and avoid collapse. Regenerative economics, circular economics, sustainability, like all of these things are proving this. But unless people believe we can do this, we will get to find out just how close to collapse we really are. So the task is to find the political will to implement solutions based on a new narrative of human well-being that meets our needs for food and energy in ways that generate jobs and build community.